This is part of a very large project going back to 2012, really, and even before then, around how we think about our role as political scientists, social scientists, and sustainability scientists in both helping figure out how to address some of the world's most thorny challenges, but also potentially our role in causing some of them as well. And I know it's a very provocative argument, but it's meant to be provocative in a very positive sense. How do we engage in a conversation to move forward in common purpose? So I thought I would just sort of focus on path dependency as both the origins and solution to this paper. And to just note that I'm trained as a Canadian political scientist, and my original fields include public policy and environmental policy. My own original epistemological orientation can be characterized as having what we call a historical institutionalist bias, in which I tend to treat rational choice and sociological approaches important, but secondary to this idea of critical junctures as creating politics. And that's why I target a lot of my own work, path dependency analysis. So in large part, my training on path dependency analysis was itself path dependent. It explains what I do a lot 30 years and 35 years later. And my original problem orientation was how to think about our role and our research in reversing or managing the impacts of humans on the Earth's fragile ecosystem. My ultimate original problem orientation. So my own path dependencies include Thaddeus Skocpol, wrote this amazing book called Bringing the State Back In. And it was a strong and powerful critique of the behavior revolution that was taking over US political science. Many argued that undermined the role of, many argued, how history and policies create politics, not just the reverse. Of course, Rachel Carson's, I think, path dependency in terms of her ideas around humans as causing so many problems that ultimately come back to hurt us as well. And even those involved in creating so much of the United States' early legislation and policies on the environment, which were around taming the human impact on them. And this is a picture of my former dean at Yale, Gus Speth, who thinks a lot about these challenges. What's fascinating, though, is even though those are my origins, I have only worked in interdisciplinary environments. Geographically, the United States, both in Alabama and Connecticut, Singapore, Europe, Australia, and a little stint in Canada. I'm Canadian, but most of my work's been elsewhere. And I've only worked in schools of forestry, the environment, at Yale, forestry at Auburn, and now public policy in Singapore. And because of that, my world has been constantly challenged by new ideas, new insights, and new ways of seeing the world. And it made me very curious. Many people now call me a bumblebee political scientist. How do we understand better different lenses that are all important in some way in making sense of this world in which we live? And what I noticed was my problem orientation was not shared by other colleagues. Even my strong support in improving the capacity of the state itself was not shared, which struck me as curious because in my own research, biodiversity conservation, even things beyond that, like healthcare policy, required a strong state. Two different.
Your PowerPoint is not showing up. So maybe for the last 5 minutes, you can show us some of those slides.
They didn't show up?
I'm not seeing it. Can anyone say if they're seeing it?
No.
We were showing it at the beginning. Now we can see it.
Now you can see it?
Yes.
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
Okay. Well, you missed the pictures. There are the pictures. Bumblebee right there. There's there's Gus Speth. There's Rachel Carson. There's Thaddeus Skocpol. Okay, there you go. Okay.
All right.
Okay. You good to go? Okay, good. So I'm glad you told me that. Okay, great. Okay, so back to the bumblebees, and then my this slide here, that my orientation and problem conception was not shared. And I noticed that two different disciplines within political science, although very distinct, were united by the belief that geographically defined local governance or subsidiarity was actually preferred to a strong state or a national state. That included anthropologists who moved to political science and also economists, and Ostrom being the leading one who moved to political science to think about governance and institutions. And their ideas and methods began to dominate environment schools, from my perception. And many of the scholars from these path-dependent backgrounds, I believe, are very strong in the IASC. And there are fewer and fewer faculty with my own bias, environment schools over time, which I found quite fascinating. And I wanted to understand why. What is going on with this shift? And so I thought about then anthropologist, political scientist James Scott, who had a very strong distaste for the state and wrote a book called Seeing Like a State. And he was a critique of central authority for being too legible and undermining local communities. And he was very much a soft anarchist for those reasons. And then likewise, Eleanor Ostrom was strongly around local governance. And even she referred to national government officials as external authorities. Things are, even use the word faceless bureaucrats as an example of people who are out there, not part of the meaningful governance of the local level. And of course, her book was the one the article really targets as impacting political science. So again, we all have our biases, but I was struck by why that was happening in the world that I was working in. And I must say, I was frustrated because I was concerned that my own path dependency community wasn't getting voices, but I was also curious about then what's going on and why are we having these different lenses and different perspectives. So the argument of the article in general is that metaphors are important. And this is actually Ostrom's argument in her book, that metaphors had undermined local communities by not being able to understand and manage resources that were not excludable, essentially, and that problem structure matters in designing effective policies. Her observation that fish swim, right? And you can't actually draw lines around them was fundamental in reinforcing the need to break away from metaphors in which you think privatization was the only answer, when in fact that can make matters worse, right? So the metaphor that Ostrom says is really important, and so do we. This is the quote that is in the article. If we're not careful about the unconscious bias of our metaphors, they might lead us to produce results that are worse than doing nothing at all, right? Okay, so that's the argument. And the work of constructivists and sociological scholars are key to understanding how the unconscious norms actually work. And Stephen co-author wrote this amazing book called The Compromise of Liberal Environmentalism, in which he actually argues that norms, not just powerful interests, help understand and explain why we move to a very market-oriented world in global environmental governance challenges. So we teamed up on this. So the provocative argument is that Ostrom didn't just smash some poorly performing metaphors. And again, she did really a great job in the private property solution, just stunningly powerful, right? But also that she created them as well. And that's very provocative, right? But there you have it. We like to be provocative and have a conversation going. So the argument is that her greatest contribution was to emphasize problem features when designing effective institutions and policies. That was hugely important. And the book that I'm now working on 5 years later on this is arguing we just don't do it very much and do very well. And she made this point, you must do it, right? But our greatest impact, we argue in the article, was actually to champion utility as an underlying global goal of sustainability policy in some way. And that, we argue, has been a tragedy for addressing environmental problems that utility motivations have actually caused. Okay, so that's the nutshell of the argument in the article. And it's got both conceptual and empirical breakthroughs to make that point. And of course, that leads to, as we know, another norm in political sciences, 2x2 tables, right? We have our major one, and we have a few other ones that reinforce that argument. And the 2x2 table also leads to 4 types of sustainability challenges, also leads us to identify 4 schools in our world that reinforce each type. I just want to review then for you this table here and get a reality check on my time. How much time roughly should I take now at this point?
2 to 3 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, perfect. So I've got extra slides, by the way. Feel free to email me to share them with you, and et cetera. And also a set of pithy slides on post-article book effort. But essentially, it boils down to two questions that we think you can actually use to distinguish and classify almost all literature of sustainability policy and governance that we're most familiar with. And so one question is, does utility as a concept, as a metaphor, dominate the analyst's orientation of the world? So now underneath that, it's a bit more detailed. Does the analysis, conclusions, and theories of an article or a project treat individuals, organizations, and states as largely self-interested, satisfaction-driven entities that seek to maximize some kind of utility outcome in some ways? One question, right? And that's a broad issue, but in general, that's the one way to distinguish. But the other one, Ostrom's greatest contribution, is the analysis on the ground problem contingent. In other words, are the conclusions and theories narrowed to understanding and or managing a clearly specified, empirically measurable on the ground problem, like fish being depleted or forests being deforested, things you could actually understand. If you're effective, you would see a change in that outcome. It cannot be abstract. And out of that comes four different types. So type one is what we refer to as the commons, being reinforced by the commons school. And that's essentially collective action problems at the level of sustainability challenges. And so the tragedy of the commons is what you all know to be the one that we know and love, in which very rational individuals over-harvest a resource because of the absence of strong collective rules and governance mechanisms. If they don't do that, their neighbors will, and so you may as well participate in short-term benefits because no one will win in the long run. And the only answer to this problem is generating long-term governance solutions. And Ostrom's contribution was saying, hey, the prevailing solution of privatization of the resource might work for problems that were easily excludable, but terrible for those that are not. And it can actually work to undermine communities and make them worse off. Okay? And that was her, big contribution in developing rules to govern those challenges, and really pushed advanced Hardin's work before that. Type two identifies being reinforced by the optimization school. The major strand of that is essentially environmental economics or cost-benefit analysis. And this school says, yeah, okay, commons people, you're great, but you could actually solve a commons problem and actually undermine overall utility because that problem's, the way to solve a problem would actually cost too much in utility. So for example, let's say you want to maintain forests, but you make much more money by having a tourism operation that would cut down the forest or that kind of thing, or a mining operation. Type 2 optimization school says you can't look at anything in isolation. You must go to the aggregate level and say, does solving this problem work for the overall economy as a whole? And so Bill Nordhaus, we talked about in the article, is famous for this, for actually arguing that the optimal solution to the climate crisis is a 3.2 degree world. And yet the ecologists tell us it's 1.5, right? So different frames lead to different problem solutions. So we say that's a wonderful problem definition, maximizing utility to improve growth and poverty and so on, but it comes with costs as well. And then the type 3 orientation is reinforced by the compromise school, which says basically governance, legitimacy, and so on, inclusion, that's what matters. Getting agreement matters, even if it's not that effective, because we need people to get along and govern and compromise on problems. And that's really important. It's led to reduced conflict around the world. It's improved engagement of marginalized groups, but it cannot solve all problems. And the paper talks about the case of Newfoundland and Canada, where they invoked a compromise solution to address a type 1 fisheries depletion crisis. And they got an agreement that was trustable and believed in. People thought that was a really good process. The only problem was the actual decision about how to reduce the quota was not in line with what the biologist said you had to do to maintain the fishery. Okay, this is true. What happened was a 25-year collapse of the resource as a result. Right, the wrong school was applied to the wrong problem. So we say in the paper that actually type 4 problems really matter, and those are ones that actually must be addressed no matter what. And we actually referred to not an environmental case as an example to begin the story, but a social case of slavery. Anti-slavery norms are so strong that you would never invoke a compromise solution to assess whether you should own slaves or a cost benefit for whether it makes sense to own slaves, because the very idea of anti-slavery sits above that. And what we're arguing in the paper is that we've lost the ability to think about type 4 problems that are caused by type 1, type 2, and type 3 conceptions. And yet we as humans do put and identify those things as being really important. And even if we didn't, if we think about biodiversity and species extinctions or the climate crisis of 1.5, we have no choice. If you want to address those problems, you must give them type 4 status or they will not be solved, right? So our point is that whether you believe this for moral reasons or just because you want to solve the climate crisis, some problems need type 4 approaches, and yet we're drifting away from that kind of thinking. And finally, we say in the article that actually this was not always the case, that in fact, in the 1970s and 60s, we did do type 4 thinking. We prioritized species, we prioritized pollution over human needs. And now we no longer do that. And we say only if you can improve human conditions can you address ecological problems. That's the gist of the article, and I'll stop talking now.
Thank you so much, Ben, for this fantastic presentation. I think we have a lot of material to discuss. Rob, are you ready for your comments?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Rob Holahan. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science at Binghamton University. I was a student of Lynn Ostrom at IU, but uniquely, I was also a student as an undergrad and master's student of Doug North. And as far as I know, I'm the only person out there who can say he was trained by both North and Ostrom. So, reading this paper, I was struck by a couple things that Doug North used to talk about. The first thing is every single time Doug North ever gave a talk that I attended, and half the time when he'd start class, he would start by saying, the social sciences have existed for 100 years as separate disciplines and we've accomplished nothing, right? But, just hearing Ben talk right now, and I have plenty of notes and I'm trying to organize them so that I don't just wander this whole time, but I'm going to wander a little bit based off of what Ben was just saying. One point that Doug North made in almost all of his work is that if a beneficial solution emerges, why does it matter how it emerged? And frequently, these beneficial solutions emerge through rational self-interest. And it might be because the ruler is seeking to increase their tax revenues or something like that. But if the end result is everybody's better off, why does it matter that that's how it came? And I think that sort of serves as a metaphor for a lot of what I'll talk about in terms of this paper, which I really liked. And I think it raises a lot of important questions. And, one thing I'd start off on, and I was saying this before, I have broad agreement that there's a problem. And I may even agree with what the problem is, but I'm not sure that I agree with what the solution the paper presents is. And so given that, I'm going to try to organize my thoughts around 4 points. Right? First is, what is the environment for? Second, is the environment in decline? Third, why wouldn't social sciences focus on human material well-being? And fourth, what's the alternative, essentially? And I think all 4 of them kind of tie into each other, so hopefully I don't jump around too much. I'm trying to keep it somewhat organized, but so I thought about adding slides, and the title, one of them was going to be The Crisis in American Public Policy, which is a nod to Vincent Ostrom in his book, The Crisis in American Public Administration from the 70s. And I do think there's a crisis in public policy theory and as a field right now. And part of it, I completely agree. It's the focus on metaphor and methodologies over questions. I don't know how many papers I review these days where there's no question. It's here's a methodology and here's applying it to a new type of metaphor or something like that. And that seems to be pretty standard these days versus, what's the fundamental question and why does this matter? A lot of my research is so I'm really interested in natural resources, and I like to say I'm an extraction guy. I'm interested in how we use resources and manage them. I'm not a preservationist. I believe in preserving some things, sure, but for the most part, I take an unabashed anthropocentric view that resources are there for humans to consume and make our lives better. The question is, how do we ensure that they're available in the long run for multiple people, and that we don't collapse everything aside. You know, one thing I'm fond of saying in my classes is if climate change, I mean, I believe in climate change, don't get me wrong, but if climate change is really happening and it's so bad, what's the real issue? It's going to kill us. The Earth will be fine. The Earth's time scale is billions of years. You know, the Earth has been through catastrophic decline before and is rebounded. So fundamentally, even a problem like climate change isn't really about the Earth. It's about us and our survival within the Earth's context. And so I take, you know, all of my classes and research kind of starts with that point that we have to have a human-centric approach. Also, I mean, just aside from the fact that public policy itself is created by humans, and as the paper points out, the problems that we face are human caused. So if they're human caused, we need human solutions. And the focus has to be on the human side of things. The problem definition itself can certainly be environmental, but the solutions have to come from a human perspective. And you know, I jotted down, you know, even Diocletian was unsuccessful in price controls in the 3rd century, right? Diocletian, the crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire, creates this list of every single good available in the economy and sets a price limit on it. And of course, everybody creates black markets and circumvents the rules. Why? Because humans are humans. And at the end of the day, individual humans are seeking to maximize their own personal utility, no matter what a strong central state says. And so I do take the local perspective a lot more seriously, I think, in my own research than a state-centric approach for that very reason. It's fine to set policy, but a policy is only as effective as um, people follow it, right? And this is one of the problems I think that a lot of the 70s type policies created. There's a lot in this paper about the you know, type 4 problems have sort of been pushed aside, but back in the 60s and 70s with your Rachel Carsons, your Garrett Hardins, your et cetera, there was a lot more focus on sort of these are fundamental problems that need to be solved. But you know, take the tragedy of the commons, for example, and it's always interests me that everybody remembers the 3 paragraphs. It's 3 paragraphs is the metaphor of the commons. The rest of the paper is an unabashed population control paper, and it's about mandatory forced population control. Nobody ever talks about that part of the paper for some reason, but I think it's because nobody's really comfortable talking about that part of the paper. But that's what the conclusions are. The conclusions are humans aren't going to stop having babies on their own, so we need to have state-sponsored population control measures. That's what it says. And that makes me uncomfortable, you know, and I think a lot of times when states get involved in these sorts of problems, the question suddenly becomes, well, which people get to survive and which people don't? And that usually leads to bad outcomes. And the problem is, you know, in all systems, there are winners and losers. Uh, and there's trade-offs in every system. That's not a shock, right? So the question as social scientists is how do we minimize the overall impacts of one policy decision to ensure that you get the desired result in that realm without, you know, exacerbating problems in others, which is something I think that this paper does a good job of talking about, right? Because the paper is really about all these whack-a-mole problems and we're trying to solve it here, but it causes problems there. And that's absolutely right. But I would also argue that I think we do have plenty of type 4 solutions still. And one example is just the creation of national monuments in the United States, which, you know, under the Antiquities Act, the president has the right to declare any national land a monument and preserve it. And an example of that was first Obama created the Pacific National Marine Sanctuary, and then Biden expanded it. And recently Trump undid part of it. But the reason that Trump undid part of it was because the fishermen from Guam and Samoa basically were cut off from their fishing grounds. And there was real economic impact for what is otherwise a marginalized group in the first place because of it. And so when Trump signed the order to undo it, and it's not clear whether he actually has legal authority to do that, he had a bunch of fishermen from those islands there, you know, cheering him on. And so even when we look at like type 4 problems, they can create, or type 4 solutions to problems, they can create their own set of whack-a-moles that you know, disadvantage certain groups. And another example I can think of is a lot of my research is on oil and gas drilling, and I live in New York State where there's a total ban on fracking. Well, 10 years ago or so, right when the ban happened, I was visiting, talking to some people out in a mobile home community in a rural part of the state. And, these are people whose home heating comes from heating oil, which is the least environmentally responsible type of heating. I mean, home heating oil is brutal, right? And it's costly. It costs, like, the average person in this community was spending 40% of their winter income on heating alone. And they looked and said, we're standing above the world's largest reserves of natural gas. Why do I have to sit here and continue to pay all this exorbitant money for this really dirty energy when there's cleaner energy below us? It's not perfect, but it's cleaner. And I think they had a point, even though obviously the connection between where you drill and where your, energy source comes from isn't exactly as clear. But, I think the paper glosses over a lot of incrementalism and positive changes in the sense that we can't compare the current state of the world to utopia. We can only compare it to what else could have been. And a lot of these type 1 to type 3 problem solutions over time, will imperfect, have moved the bar to increase certain types of environmental sustainability. I would say if you look at water quality today, it's not infinitely, it's significantly better than it was in the 70s, for example, right? And that didn't necessarily it did in part come from federal mandates, but it also came from shifts in technology and behavior and everything else along the way. As countries like the United States and developing countries cleaned up their local environments, we also did a lot of offshoring. The paper discusses the northern spotted owl case, which I think is fascinating. But, kind of left out in that discussion is we offshored our timber harvesting. So we're just taking down other people's trees, etc. And so I'm already out of time, so I will just quickly wrap up. See what my point is. Overall, I think I agree that type 4 problem definitions are useful and helpful, but we need type 1 to 3 problem solving in order to get there. Because in the end, humans are humans, and humans are going to do what humans are going to do. And if you ignore the micro foundations of all this, I don't want to say dystopian, but I don't necessarily like where some of that goes. And I'll stop there, even though that was not a very good ending. So, but overall, I love that this is being asked, and I think it's important that we start talking about this stuff.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Maria Claudia.
Thank you again for this invitation. And in the same way that Rob started by telling us a little bit about his position, let me tell you a little bit about my positionality reading this paper. I always say that I was an economist in my previous life. So my PhD is in economics, but I have distanced myself from that even at the same time that I was doing my PhD. So, and why is that? Is because I have a huge influence of years of doing field work and doing field work with different tools, including behavioral experiments, as you will see a little bit in my presentation. And nowadays, I work in the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University, and that is embedded in me as well. Like that, how important the concept of community sustainability could be. So I read the paper, and I will say that I dissect the paper. I was looking at different angles to study it, and I am sorry, but I don't like the title. I have conflicts with the title in itself, among other things because I'm not convinced that you are really bringing the environment back. And I'm not convinced either that you are giving too much power to the commons in the title. And the paper is much more than the commons. So let me separate these two ideas. So I feel that the paper is very anthropocentric. So the paper is telling us how important, what is the role that nature plays in provide us goods and services, and how we should create policies to make sure that we can do that in a sustainable way with this fallacy that can be the sustainable development. Like we are talking about that, but we are still talking about development. So this argument or the paper does not take into consideration less Western views in which Mother Earth is a whole, and we are just humans that are part of that system. I'm missing that discussion in the paper. So that's why I'm saying, is really the article bringing the environment back? When we look at type 4, the type 4 solutions or the type of policies, I feel that we are missing there. What is that we have learned from native systems of knowledge? What is that indigenous communities all over the world have brought to that type 4 system? We have learned that we have to learn to live within the limits that Mother Earth gives to us, and that is not addressed in the paper at all. So I feel, and I'm not a political science here, but I feel that policies in general need to acknowledge that we have failed to take into consideration what is that Mother Earth can provide to us. And that will take me to the second part of what I didn't like about the title of the paper, and is that it gives too much power to the commons, or it critiques the commons without forgetting the fact that they are those type 2, type 3s, and type 4 types of policies as well. So I struggle a lot with table 1, and I really like the fact that Ben was presenting it in his presentation. And I feel that the explanation that he provides here today, and even what the access are much better explained today than in the paper. But because in my notes, I have notes about what is that economic utility rational, and what is the application for a specific type of problems that you have in the original paper. That was not clear to me. But something that I struggle a lot with the paper, something that you mentioned and somehow to me is so central to the paper and somehow is hidden in the way that the paper is written today, is that Western thoughts have an obsession with economic growth. And so you have those figures 3 and 4 that are showing how much we have grown, and yes, it's great that we have less poverty, let's say, like, yes, that is great. But at the same time, we have an increased amount of CO2 emissions. And as a consequence of all this, we have those figures that, if I remember correctly, are 5 and 6, in which we are seeing deforestation rates and biodiversity loss. And that to me is central in the paper. Like the paper to me should evolve around how to solve this dilemma of this problem of this obsession with growth that may create many, like that from there is that we need to look at all these other types of policies that should solve that problem. Can we create policies that solve the problem of our obsession with economic growth? That being said, I think that the paper is a little bit unfair then with the commons, because like even though, and with the commons and with Ostrom, I felt that the paper is based on the work that Ostrom did in 1990, and it forgets 25 years of her research. And she evolved and she became a new scholar on those 25 years. Like when she wrote the paper in 1990, she takes into consideration the articles and the work of many people, including anthropologists and political science, that were doing research in many places of the world to identify these design principles. But over the years, she learns a lot of what you described today as type 4. She created the IFRIC, She created SciPec. She developed the SES framework, and even when she develops the SES framework, she says that they are not panaceas. It's not that she was saying that there was one policy that was going to fit every single case. She is very clear that they are not panaceas. Even her way of working with game theory changes over the years. What she does in the 1990s is what I will consider very traditional way of doing game theory that was influenced by people that were doing a lot of field work and doing experiments in the field, like Juan Camilo Cárdenas and myself, where we realized that many of the things that we were seeing in the field, or that people that were doing experiments in the field, we were not seeing that when we were doing that with people that were using their natural resources in their daily life, and they were participating in these games. So I feel that it's great that you are using the governing of the commons, but at the same time, you are missing 25 years of her legacy and how she evolved in those 25 years. And when I say that the paper is like I don't like as much the title, is that I also feel that the paper oversimplifies how complicated and difficult it is to get to collective action. Like somehow the paper argues or makes the reader think that type 1 solutions are very easy to find or very easy to get to. And that is quite the opposite. Like communities, when they can get to that collective action, they have to spend a lot of time and effort in crafting these institutions for them to work. And I don't think, like, at any point, Ostrom wanted to believe that every single community was going to be able to get there. Like, I feel that the paper fails to acknowledge how difficult it is to get to that type 1 solution and how only few communities can do it. And we need to understand what are some of the characteristics of those communities that have been able to achieve that. When she describes the design principles, she says that these are sufficient, but not necessarily. So that we need more, having fulfilling the design principles is not enough to what we want to do. And as I say, I appreciate the fact that you explain better table 1. I'm still not clear, and I want to have a conversation about this, about what is the economic utility rational in type 1? What is that is being maximized there? Because for me, is not one thing, maybe it's a mix of things, and then that maximization gets a little bit more tricky, and we are oversimplifying by saying that that is only one thing that we are maximizing in that case. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Claudia,
Thank you.
for your intervention and comments. We have Prakash.
Thank you. This has been really fascinating so far. So I really want to thank Ben and Stephen and Rob and Maria Claudia for getting us to a point where there's so much stuff happening on my brain floor. But I try to control myself to sort of be disciplined. So, I think big picture contribution of the paper is that in many ways, Ben and Stephen are trying to bring us to think about how do we think about different values and normative frameworks, and how do they creep into policies and institutions and scholarship on policies and institutions. And I think it's a really important agenda, but as you can imagine, it's also a sort of a double-edged sword, because it's very challenging once you tread on a normative territory, because one normative territory sort of tussles with the adjacent normative questions. And in the context of environment being a wicked problem, it intersects with other kinds of normative considerations in ways that are far too complicated to be parsed out in the way the paper is trying to do. So I think we are dealing with some really complex discussions here, and I want to speak to those. But I should also add that I'm speaking also in my capacity as co-founder of the Ostrom Working Group on Power, Inequality, and Justice, where we have done, spent a decade and a half, brainstorming and developing sort of tools and solutions to the kind of questions we thought the early scholarship missed. So I'm also adding my word to Maria Claudia's word, suggestion that there's a lot of work that both the Ostroms did, but also the broader community of Bloomington School has done on some of these questions. And I think paper and your forthcoming book could actually engage more with that work. But having said that, I really want us to be thinking about the micro foundations of the Ostrom tradition. And thankfully, I was thinking that maybe Rob will do some of that, but that was not part of his comment. So I'm happy to go into that territory, which is my favorite. And it's this question of normative foundations is related very closely to this notion of deductive versus inductive. And you point out that Ostroms did both, right? And one could think about the theory of collective action, which is deductively generated and is broader than the inductively generated design principles. Now, of course, when you have these kinds of connections, we also have the abductive reasoning, which goes back and forth between deductive and inductive. And I would see Lynn Ostrom as being one of the top-notch practitioners of abductive reasoning, which is also actually a good way of building cumulative knowledge, scientific knowledge, and addressing the limitations of the reductive task of model building. So, just as a purely scientific enterprise, abductive reasoning of the type that Lynn Ostrom promoted is really, it goes to the foundation of the scientific enterprise. And that, I think, is why she won the Nobel Prize. So let me take some of the core arguments from your fantastic article. First argument was that Ostrom's work reinforced the quest for universal analytical framework to adjudicate any type of sustainability challenge. I think that, as Maria Claudia already pointed out, that argument needs to be thought through more carefully. And I want to quote from the 1990 book. And so I read the 1990 book slightly differently. I think there's a lot of stuff in the book that needs to be talked about. And so on page number 26, Lynn says that the approach that she's developing in the book does not apply to situations in which participants can produce major external harm for others. So fossil fuel industry, or even the agribusiness community as it is developed over the decades. All asymmetric pollution problems are excluded, as in any situation in which a group can form a cartel and control a sufficient part of the market to affect market prices. So, and obviously all of these are big problems, logging, fracking, and all of that stuff. And I think it goes to what Lynn thought was left out of the common pool problematic that she was developing. And this then takes us to larger discussion of rational choice and rationality. I think to me, in my not so humble opinion, the single most important weakness of the article is that it misses how Ostroms actually developed the idea of rational choice. Of course, they were riding on the shoulders of the other giants who had already developed arguments about bounded rationality. And so I think you're constantly conflating the notion of bounded rationality that Ostroms used with the reductive notion of rationality that the neoclassical economic discipline uses. And that makes you miss so many of the arguments. And so, for example, Lynn's argument about bounded rationality are very different. They're actually, and this was one of the point of departure for Lynn, where she actually started by shooting down the prisoner's dilemma and the kind of homo economicus reasoning that you seem to attribute to governing the commons. If that was the, and if we take your argument, you also sort of actually contradict within the article where you say that Lynn so focus on improving the sustainability of specified natural resources such as forest leaves out the option that if you cut down the forest, there might be minerals, right? Ostrom's never went down that road. And so that is actually a clear evidence that there's a very significant difference between the Ostroms and the broader economics, the optimization school as you are describing it. And more particularly, Lynn talks about 4 internal variables that are part of the model of the individual that Lynn developed, which was quite different from the neoclassical economics model. And those 4 internal variables were expected benefits. So, that kind of economic rationality, expected cost, but then there's internal norms. And these norms come from being part of a cultural community, being part of an ideological community, being part of a different regional context in which libertarian localism is not a thing. For the large part of the world, libertarian localism does not exist. And so that's really important to bear in mind. And then, of course, within economics, there's the idea of discount rates that was part of the model of the individual. And so among the major contributions that Lynn sort of made, and Maria Claudia talked about this a little bit, her 1998 presidential address was a behavioral approach to rational choice theory, where she explicitly told the community we need to make a departure from the standard rational choice. And as part of the Nobel lecture, also she explicitly talked about it and the focus on trust, reciprocity, and reputation. Now, granted, many of these elements were underdeveloped in Lynn's own work, and part of that is probably sort of getting some signals from the broader context and system and moving the research program in certain directions over other directions. But other people have done that kind of work, and I think it's sort of very adjacent to the Ostrom tradition. And I'll wrap up with 2 quick points here, to add to this argument about the sort of the micro foundations of the Ostrom theory. The second most important gap in the article's portrayal of the Ostrom school is in the idea of difficulty of exclusion versus non-exclusion. Common pool resources are not about non-exclusion. They're about difficulty of exclusion. And that's a huge difference in the Ostrom school, where it's almost like Ostrom 101, because the design principle first says clearly defined boundaries, and boundaries are around both resources and community, right? So exclusion from the group that is directly attached to the commons is actually part of the very core of the theory of common pool resources. And the article seems to have missed that or misunderstood that. And so finally, I would say, if we talk about some of the broader questions that Rob started us off on, and I think those questions are really important to sort of consider. And I want to conclude on that note, that one, I think your paper sort of does a good job of really bringing up those big picture questions that have been sometimes lost in some parts of the Ostrom community. There are Hayekians, and there are all kinds of Ostrom community people, and we all love them very much. But I think they're also like radical political ecologists and people who think about power and inequality and global south and decolonization and all that stuff, right? But I think the regional context that particularly Ben's comments, the early comment that you introduced to set up the problem, I think the regional context of North America, and in particular the Midwestern, libertarian communism kind of communities, libertarian communism or localism communities, that is actually a big problem that we should be addressing. And in conflating one particular type of local community, which is the libertarian localism community that you're quite familiar with all local communities, there's a big mistake that's happening here in terms of sort of thinking about this notion of elevating environmental concerns defined as separate from society and community and so forth. I think that gets us into that territory where we think about, what is the environment? What is it for? How do different communities and different people understand environment? And I think going forward, it'll be nice to clarify some of those contextual differences in how we understand the locals and supra-local or subnational and national kind of relations. I have a couple of more points on this broader discussion, but I think we could sort of start by getting into a discussion, and then I could come back to some of these larger questions of environmentalism and global South environmentalism and indigenous peoples stuff and all that kind of stuff. But I think I'd really love to hear from you about some of these kinds of basic arguments about rational choice, about the notion of exclusion, and so forth, which actually sort of gets to the core of the way you're critiquing. And finally, I would agree with Maria Claudia's sort of assessment that I think you are literally, if you read the second half of the paper, you're talking very little about the common school. Your attack is basically on the economic optimization school. And so I think you should focus more on that because you're actually focusing more on that. It's just that the framing, for whatever reason, is focused on commons, but many of your substantive arguments are about the economic optimization school and the poverty of social and environmental thinking in that school. And so that's where I think we can all unite and make a big sort of front to take this discussion. So thank you for your attention and appreciation.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments. Then I will give you the opportunity to respond. Of course, I just wanted to mention that we can clearly see the importance of your paper because of all the conversations that it generates and how it speaks to many different approaches to the environment. So thank you again for your paper. I will give you the opportunity to respond, and then we will also open it up for a broader discussion with our audience. You can leave also your questions in written form. We will address them also after Ben has the opportunity to reply.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just say I'll say a few things now, and then I know Stephen will want to come in and respond as well. So I'll just be kind of brief now because these were really wonderful comments. So I'm grateful for them. And I think the main purpose of the article was to generate this kind of conversation back and forth, and I'm just really grateful. And in fact, a lot of your comments I have thought deeply about over the last 5 years working on this book-length manuscript, just never ending, in part because of the comments you're making. I'm trying to incorporate into them in very careful ways. I revised all the schools actually that I think you would all appreciate given the comments you're making. So let me just make a couple of broad points given all that. Prakash, on your last point, and I think your exclusion one is also important. Yeah, in fact, I came at this. So part of the issue is a personal one. And I say this, and I don't mean to be more provocative, but I noticed at Yale's environment school where I was that we were increasingly hiring more economic optimization scholars, and we were getting a reduced number of sociological scholars and also regular people like me. We were becoming marginalized in a school where that was the original reason for its, at least it's not post-1972 origins anyway. So that was very confusing to me, and I needed to get a handle on that. And then when we were getting people who were not like that, they were ones that were utility friendly. And that's why I was thinking about these questions. So Prakash, totally understand it. I actually, therefore, I came at this a little bit angry. But then when I realized Ostrom's greatest contribution was a problem-focused approach, I embrace that. So I actually think I agree with you that the problem is that hasn't been adopted by a lot of other communities. But if we take our problem orientation, look at problem structure and work from that to solutions, then we can discuss the problem, right? And so we're to Robert's point. Yeah, I mean, far be it from me to say the problem ought to be humans causing the environment. I happen to think that, but that's not so relevant for our analytical abilities. Just the way Robert's concerns about humans over the environment is also relevant. What's relevant is actually our frameworks for understanding these problems, and then we can apply whatever we want to them. But if we end up actually advocating for humans over the environment, or environment over humans, without interrogating the unconscious bias of the methods we've been trained to look at, that I think is tragic. And I think students should be aware of that. At the environment school at Yale, that was tragic. We were not teaching them about that. We were saying this is the way to see the problem. And so in many ways, that's reinforcing Lynn's original point, right? That metaphors can do that. So I embrace her. I think that's her biggest contribution. If we lean into that as a community and say that's the contribution she's made and follow that, whatever we do at our different frameworks, I'll be very happy as a scholar. And I think what Prakash and you are all saying that you would agree. So that's great. That's fantastic. On the exclusion one, I can't answer in detail. I've been thinking about it so much, but basically there's a few dimensions to that, right? So ultimately her original rationale was fit swim. I mean, and therefore you can't do things the way you think you can do. And that sounds simple, right? But of course it's hugely complicated. But it was around excludability being impossible. It was. And then it became, as Robert said, or Maria, the degree of. But still, that led her then bringing her framework into forests. But forests you could have excluded. And so you did expand it. You had drift in the idea that got broader and broader. So I think we can unpack a bit more of that exclusion aspect going in both directions. But I do appreciate the ultimate question is, how does thinking about exclusion therefore affect our solutions that we find? And that's the actual question we all want to think about. For me, like even again in my own world at Yale and elsewhere, we move from saying things like, I treat the world as a collective action problem. I conceive of it that way, and therefore I do the following, to this is a collective action problem, and therefore the rational answer is the following. We've forgotten about our conceptions of the problem always being there, unavoidable. They're unavoidable. We have to conceive of a problem a certain way. It's impossible not to. But that conception is a choice we can make. But we're not doing that. Our methods are giving us the conception, and we're not training students that you're conceiving of this a certain way, and they go, I'm working on public goods, or I'm working on collective action problems. No, you're not. You're working on a thing that's being conceived of that way, and it's got all kinds of biases attached to it that you should be aware of when you deploy your frameworks. So anyway, I think we would agree. Couple of small points, because I know we can go on forever. Maria, I think your point's interesting because you're actually arguing the opposite of Robert. You're saying that we didn't talk about degrowth and the greater important problems about the Earth itself. And I love that. I agree, you're right. This article couldn't do everything. That's kind of behind the sort of the rationale. People like Paul Wapner and people do this very well, right? This is kind of like thinking about that world and what it tells us. As well. But I would say the following, the book's working on this. The problem with the degrowth as a solution is that it's still also abstract. And so I'm working on the last half of the book to say, well, okay, that's fine and dandy, but what does that mean in practice? How do we actually develop institutions that then address the problems that may or may not result in degrowth per se, but they'll be the outcome of a problem-solving orientation if we want to go in that direction. Yeah, there were so many other points. I feel like saying to you guys, I got to send you the response to reviewers of 5 years ago, because that got into detailed responses to the very points you're making. But maybe to give Stephen a chance, I'll just say thank you. I also agree that Lynn evolved. That's why we kind of toned down our future Lynn critique and just said the original article did this. And we're all evolving. My question again is, are we evolving in a way that is addressing problems? And finally, maybe just to conclude by saying, Robert, yes, some problems have been addressed like monuments, but we're facing a catastrophic ecological crisis. And as the article ends by saying, is it really true that 1, 2, and 3 types will solve type 4 problems? That's kind of the argument you're making. Or is it better to give these problems type 4 conceptions? Because if you're right, you shouldn't care, because type 4 will then be synergistic with type 1 and 2 and 3. But if you're wrong, we get a catastrophic outcome. So I'm making the opposite point, that we must treat climate as a type 4 problem, or we could be hooped. So I'll stop there for now. But thank you so much. Just wonderful, really grateful.
Yeah, that was great. I don't have too much to add to Ben. I too really very much appreciate the comments, and I think Ben will agree that many points in the discussion are elements of discussions and debates, and sometimes very hard debates, that Ben and I also had in the writing of the article, because it's raised many of the issues that we were really trying to address. And I would just echo Ben in saying that the article was trying to raise a lot of these discussions, and we recognize in a single article it's not possible to get into all of that nuance. But you've certainly raised a number of points. So let me just just three maybe specific things. So one, in terms of Rob, totally appreciate the comments. I think that there's just two things that I hope the article helps with in terms of the big thinking. One is that we don't actually, or at least my view is that we're not favoring one over the other, although we're pointing out that type 4 has been sort of ignored or pushed to the background. So it's not to say that it's wrong to take another kind of approach, or that there might be solutions that fit with certain conceptions. It's to be sensitive to problem fit. That's sort of our main argument. And there I would just say that there's two things that really came out in your comments. And one is pragmatic and one is normative. So the pragmatic is just the question of, does it work? And I think that that's also very much what drove a lot of Ostrom's work, but which drives, I think, a lot of our work. And the second is what do we value? And so the article is trying to point out is that when you're in these different schools or ways of thinking, you may be bringing in certain things that you value and not be self-conscious about them. And I think that that's very important. And you said a lot about things that we should value and so on. And we could have debates about that and how we center humans, how we center ecosystems, how we center Mother Earth, how we have different conceptions of so on. And so the article was trying to open up space for those kinds of discussions and to suggest they should be more front and center. The one thing I would push back on is the part about incrementalism. And there, on the one hand, I don't disagree that there can be progress on many things. In other work that I'm doing, one of the things that we find, particularly looking at climate change, is that often there are traps. We get stuck in certain things. And I think there we do have to be sensitive and reflect on certain kinds of things, let's say like fuel switching. So the example you gave about natural gas. We should, on the one hand, great, that's an advancement, certainly over oil and coal. But if we get stuck in using natural gas, we're not going to address the climate problem even in the medium term, but certainly not in the long term. So that's something, again, that I think that this hopefully helps us think about. On Maria, unbelievably fantastic comments. I wonder if we're talking at a little bit of cross purposes, because when I heard your comments, I thought, oh, fantastic. We're in total agreement with you in the sense that we're not favoring one over the other. We're trying to open up space for exactly this kind of argument. You are absolutely right that we did not go into different normative visions, different understandings of the relationship of human and nature, different epistemologies, and so on. I think that one of the things that we were suggesting is that at least in the first three, those are actually imported, whereas in type 4, at least there's an openness, but it's true, we didn't get into how might, for example, an epistemology that is more centered on Mother Earth, for example, as you talk about, what might that look like in terms of then how we think about those relationships. So it is a deficit in the article. I totally agree. But I think that there's a lot of space to open that up and because on the solution side, it's true that we don't really get into that in terms of the cultural elements, in terms of the epistemologies and so on. And so that could be certainly somewhere that we could go or others could go. But I kind of hope that we open up space for that. And your comments suggested to me that in fact we had. And Prakash, just the big takeaway for me is that, again, Ben and I had all these debates about what Ostrom said, what she didn't say, and so on. And what it came down to, and I think, this is where Ben's voice really came out and persuaded me, is that, okay, we could argue about some of these things, but the fact of the matter is that these metaphors or these ways of thinking about it or thinking about the 1990 book, this has translated into framings of policy in a very, very, very powerful way. And so I would say, yes, if we look in the what's actually being done by people who work in these traditions, if we look at a lot of the inductive work, if we look at SES and how it's evolved, although I have some personal problems with SES, we can see there's a lot of nuance and debate about it. And yet a lot of where those critiques or other things that might be looked at, they're not considered because we're very bracketed by certain kinds of approaches that then often do get translated into very big policies. So I would agree that it is more the type 2 stuff that concerns me in terms of limitations in that a lot of this, it's not working. But I think it's those tensions that are there in Ostroms and in the tradition of people who work in the Ostrom tradition that are there, that are often getting lost when they then move into the policy realm. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Ben, you want to add something?
Can I come back for a second?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because those are wonderful responses, Stephen. And I did want to highlight a couple of things that respond also to Prakash's point too, about very specific choices Ostrom made in her framework that did have lasting legacies, whether it was intended or not. So one debate Steve and I had for a long time was on her use of the label private goods. And a lot of people thought that meant that therefore the solution was private property. But her private goods category was a way to describe a set of subtractable resources that were also excludable. And they could be either state ownership or privatization as a way to solve that problem. So the independent variable and dependent variable get conflated a lot because of that confusion. The labels are so close to each other. And Steve and I went back for a long time on this and to really unpack that, right? But that slip from describing a good as being a private good to then saying it needs privatization has that lasted unconscious bias that Ostrom would, I think, agree on. And that slip is important because if you go to club goods, which is the one where you have, it's not subtractable, but it is excludable, including like toll roads, for example. Her student, Asim Prakash, has done wonderful work on club goods, but treating it as the independent variable, as the tool to achieve something else. And that wasn't Ostrom's way of conceiving of that at all. It was actually of that being a good in itself. And the slight challenge with that then is if that's the focus of your research as being a dependent variable, but it's actually an independent variable, you don't know the outcomes of that. And so the work on club goods is around who supported a club, a private good, an eco-label, and so on. But then what does that mean for the actual other problem out there gets interrogated in the same way that this conversation would be thinking about. So those are just two subtle ways in which that works that I think are quite challenging. On the epistemology one, I should mention too, again, this article has been really important. I mentioned in the first slide a whole bunch of other articles. And one with Ingrid Bisson-Hamakers in Cambridge Press, we did engage transformative or epistemological scholars on this very question. So just to reinforce, it's a good point, and we are working on that integration as well.
We have a queue, but also a question from the audience. So I don't know, Prakash, if you also want to address the question. I think it is an overall comment, and we've been answering that question as we talk. So yes, please, Prakash, go ahead.
Right. So I just wanted to quickly sort of respond to this discussion of exclusion and private goods issue. The relationship between the institutional dimensions of property rights and the qualities of the good itself, like the thing, fish or forest, that connection is quite complex. And so, at a very broader level, I think that's a separate discussion that, we might actually lose a lot of audience if we get into that. And I think, there's still work to be done on that side. So I think it's a good debate to have later on. I also wanted to quickly say, on the exclusion part, the article that sort of laid out the framework of common pool goods and all that stuff, that was from 1977, led by Vincent Ostrom. So the framing of common pools has never changed. What you're referring to is the ways in which Ostrom's incorporated the nature of the good, the properties of the thing itself, into the analysis of management of goods, right? So that's where fish versus forest story sort of comes into picture. But just on the exclusion part, common pool are different from public goods. And so that part is really important. And I think clarifying some of these questions about rational choice and exclusion and membership and all that is really foundational to the arguments that you're making. And that will actually move you more towards the thinking about the economic optimization school that does a poor job of thinking about all of those things that Ostrom's did actually think about.
Yeah, I'll keep this short because I could go on about this for hours, but you brought up, you opened the floodgates by bringing up, types of goods. And Gwen Arnold and I, before COVID, actually were working on a project on creating like a dynamic theory of goods, because one of the few things Ostrom and I disagreed on regularly was whether the nature of a good is stagnant or whether it can change. And she was fundamental that a type of good is a type of good, and then you assign property rights to it, and those property rights can be anything. But, I think that biological or biophysical changes in a resource can change the nature of it, and technological improvements can change our ability to access it in such a way to fundamentally change it. Gwen and I, then COVID happened, and we just have not gotten back to that, but we have a whole working paper on it and everything else. And to Prakash's point, another issue I see broadly as a problem in social sciences is the conflation of types of goods. So like you'll see a paper that purports to be discussing public goods, and they have a bunch of common pool resources thrown into the equation. And that fundamentally alters the structure of the equation itself. And so just being careful about what it is we're talking about is a challenge, but something that I think social scientists need to own up to. And I think that's kind of one of the points you're getting at. And in the broader sense, the misreading of Ostrom is probably more prevalent than what she actually wrote in a lot of ways. And what you're dealing with is the misunderstanding, or her legacy isn't necessarily what she wrote, it's people's understanding of it. And I think that's a fascinating point. That's absolutely right. I'll stop there.
I want to thank again Ben and Stephen. Yes, Ben, please.
Sorry, just a quick thing. Robert, please send I love your last point. Ostrom did move from biophysical features to include cultural features at some point, and that was fascinating in itself. And I'm still thinking what that means, actually. So please do send that paper.
Thank you, Ben and Stephen. We have one question, and we have time for a couple of questions if you want to post them on our Q&A. I think I will not read the whole question. I think it is a broader comment on how important Maria Claudia's point is, and how to really listen to the environment, which is something that you mentioned that is important to your work. Both Ben and Stephen mentioned it. I think the last part of the question is something that we perhaps can address a little bit closer. And I have to say that I'm biting my tongue, because coming from political ecology and being part of the IPBES most recent report in which we address this kind of questions, I would like to also jump to the conversation. But the question is, how do how do we reconcile the pace of natural processes with the pace of capitalism and its industrialization? What is that tension? How we understand that tension, I think, is an important part. I don't know who wants to answer. Ben.
I'll just start by saying one thing that happened in the course of this paper was one of the reviewers, again, the one that was most critical, which of course was ended up being the best reviewer, I thought that I was calling the Ostrom community unethical. And I wasn't trying to do that. So the massive revisions just before I was about to submit it to just say every school actually has ethical foundations, as does the optimization school, by the way. They all have very strong ethics. So when you say a school is not being ethical, and I think I probably can be guilty of implicitly doing that, you actually get people's backs up and they're being ethical. They're doing things they think are going to be really important. I mean, economic growth to alleviate poverty and get money for schools is a very noble endeavor. So if we can move away from you're not being ethical and instead saying you've got a certain set of ethics that inform your methods that are usually unconscious, but they're there, and your methods are the ones that actually do the driving, but the ethics were the ones that created the methods. And we can understand and interrogate that. The more we can understand then, what are the ethics that we want to have as individuals versus the ones that were given to us as students? And how do we want to have that conversation? And that to me then means having this very kind of talk right now. But like in the Lee Kuan Yew School, most of the faculty there are type 2. And they believe this is an ethically moral place to go, and they're about poverty alleviation. And that's, to me, noble. The problem is it's not the only ethics around there. So going back to Maria Claudia's point, my concern about absolutely, we must do what you said. We must go to the actual, what's our thinking about the world and deeper engagement with the earth. That's kind of the point of the article, actually. But my concern is that the current way we do that is to say, oh, we need a new ethics. And we need to get together on ethical frames. But I think that's not going to work because there's different ethics at play here. I think the more we identify what it is we want to achieve, like a 1.5 degree world, for example, and then work backwards from that, Ostrom's contribution and problem focus, to me, that would be the way to get more effective results. And that's why the book that I'm working on is around this policy creation euphoria, implementation depression cycle, where we say we're doing type 4 policies rhetorically, but we're using type 1 and 2, 3 solutions. So how do you actually design, once you agree on a type 4 outcome, how do you design the policies to achieve them? To me is where the action is at and might give more teeth to a degrowth argument that can seem too abstract.
I could just jump in on the question. I think to me, there's a fundamental paradox in environmental policy, right? And the paradox is we don't care about something until it becomes scarce. As long as the good times are happening, there's no reason to think deeply about a lot of environmental problems, but we get good, effective policies that emerge when a fishery collapses or, something bad often has to happen before there's the political motivation to enact policies and stuff like that. So, I don't have an answer to the question in terms of reconciling the pace of natural processes with the pace of capitalism and industrialization. But I guess I'm slightly more optimistic than most people, just in the sense that if stuff starts getting really bad, we'll be forced to confront it. But until that point, I'm not convinced that there's a political will to do something. And I'm not making a political statement on that. I'm making a kind of an analytical statement that, one of the issues that I see in terms of a lot of environmental policy is, as elites, we can all sit here and agree that these problems exist, but until your everyday person is confronted with the realities of climate change, they're not going to care. And there's nothing we can do about that other than like a fundamental reordering of elementary education, which, so I don't know. It's complex.
I can carry on that discussion actually about the thing that there was one more point that I wanted to add to this discussion. One, again, I think sort of thinking, Diana, did you say something? I think
no,
you were
but just
muted.
mentioning that we will have to start wrapping up. So we have Prakash, yes, Ben, and then Stephen. They all raised their hands. Go ahead.
Great. The connection between, which is also one of the points that comes up in the article, the connection between scholarship and policymaking is very complicated, and right. So, and then Maria Claudia pointed that out. There's a larger political economy. The concept of sustainable development came way before the 1990 book, and it was appropriated by the larger political economy in certain ways. Similarly, Ostrom's work is appropriated in a certain way. And I think we have to be sort of thinking about to what extent you can attribute that kind of policy appropriation to the work itself. Now, of course, you can imagine that certain kinds of work is more amenable to or vulnerable to appropriation. You know, so that, and so at that level, I think it brings us back to this question of what role do scholars have to sort of attack the larger barriers that are preventing us from getting to the type 4 kind of, you know, approach to thinking about environment. And on that count, I differ with Rob, because I think we can take the status quo as given, and the political economy will lead us to a path where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Or we can band together in different ways and try and mobilize different knowledge networks and epistemic communities and whatnot, and IPCC and IPBES and all of that stuff. And maybe things will start changing, and they have started changing a little bit. You know, if you look at the fossil fuel divestment movement and the scholarship that has come around that, I think there is evidence that we can get to that point, right? So just continuing to think about the relationship between scholarship and policy works.
Yep.
Can I just jump in here? So Prakash just made one of the points that I want to make. I do think we have a responsibility. Prakash said it quite eloquently, and I think that it's a bit of a cop-out for us to say, well, people will just act that way. There's agency in the world, and we intervene in the world all the time. Governments intervene all the time, and people change. That's the history of humanity. And so how much, where, how, et cetera, those are big debates. But I think that that's you know, something for us to think about. The other thing I want to say, again, Prakash already hinted at this, is in this sort of sustainable development. So I can make it very concrete, sort of an applicability of this. So one of the things that I'm thinking about as an extension of this work is the question of coherence, like this in the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And there's this idea out there that's driven by, I'd say, kind of type 3 thinking. And I think it came up in our discussion too, that all of these good things, all of these different positions can go together. We can find ways for them to fit. And in fact, that's fundamentally what's at the bottom of the optimization school. I think in a way it's there in Ostrom, although I think confronted a little bit more with the kind of sensitivity to culture and different values and so on. But one of the interesting things is that there's now a lot of some work coming out on the Sustainable Development Goals, that if you, in developing coherent, but we're always concerned about synergies and how things go together and all the good things go together in sustainable development. The research is that what often happens when you try to do that is that it actually exacerbates inequalities. It can have some negative outcomes. Sometimes it works, but often it doesn't. And it's because we pay very little attention to trade-offs. We always think that things can be synergistic and go together, and sometimes they don't. And again, this is one of the things that, to me, is one of the important things that the article raises that we need to think about. So what is our responsibility? And also that not all good things always go together. And so we should be thinking about that in the approaches to problem solving that we might be taking.
Yeah. Do I have time to come in for a quick sec? Yeah. On those last 2 points, yeah, I mean, so the book as a whole section now on synergies bias. Most scientists in IPCC believe there are synergies among 90% of the SDGs. When you get into their actual analysis, it's all hot air, and there aren't synergies among the major challenges if you look at the things we care about. So going to Rob's point, until things get bad, we are in the midst right now of the 6th great extinction of the planet. Right now, it's getting bad. We've gone over 1.5. Things are there already. The question is, why aren't we responding with policies that will address future challenges? And the historically embedded nature of this is critical, because we were addressing these things 50 years ago. we did do type 4 thinking. So if we're playing a role in undermining political feasibility through our frameworks and through our lenses, we have a responsibility to make those unconscious biases explicit and then have that conversation and say, how can we change them? And that's the main part of the article that I think is the tragedy is not so much Ostrom, it's how she's being taken to Prakash's point, and we have a responsibility to reflect Stephen's point on doing that because we are both scholars and citizens. I think that's really important. And I'm just saying maybe finally, Ostrom, who I only met twice, but each time was amazing. I think her spirit, I mean, she would love this conversation, right? How do you have these conversations? And she did it in a way that was really kind and also incredibly brilliant. And maybe we can be inspired by that, because I think this conversation is being kind, but also it's being really pushing each other, but towards common purpose of how do we generate the knowledge for solving these problems and not putting them off into the future.
Thank you so much, Ben. I think that is a perfect final line for this very, very interesting conversation. Thank you, everybody, again. Thank you for all of those who joined us today.
Thank you. Wonderful. Really grateful for this.
Thank you very
fantastic.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.